Hi everyone, my name is Theodor Mitev, and in this short lecture titled Series and Iteration Adventures in Distributed Production, I want to give you a few examples of distributed production and hopefully help you think about creation online in a new way. Hopefully provoke you into thinking about project development online along new tracks. To that end, I will talk a little bit about paradigms and the difference between the legacy media industry paradigm and the internet paradigm. And I'll try and illustrate how the internet paradigm allows the emergence of a new aesthetics, of a new type of content appearing, which in turn is an illustration of this phenomenon of distributed production. And I will spend the third part of the lecture talking about distributed production and giving you a few examples of that. And we will end by trying to understand this phenomenon of distributed production from the perspective of these concepts of series and iteration, the creation of serialized content which is iterated over time in an open process environment. I want to start though by proposing a certain way of looking at information. Why? Because this is really necessary in order to understand how distributed network production, how distributed network flows of content actually operate. So here is a very nice take on information by author David Mitchell, and this comes from his book Ghostwritten. The human world is made of stories, not people. The people the stories used to tell themselves are not to be blamed. And this is a really interesting take because it turns on its head, obviously, our notion that humans generate stories and humans are at the center of agency when it comes to the flow of information. Whereas you could turn this around and look at humans simply as tools for self-replication, which stories use to self-replicate through a process of imitation, jumping from mind to mind. And I say this for a reason, because that specific interpretation was proposed by Richard Dawkins in his book The Selfish Gene, in which he coined the term memes. And the specific quote here is: memes propagate themselves in the meme pool by leaping from brain to brain via a process which in the broad sense can be called imitation, right? And the reason why he coined these bits of information, he termed them as memes, is because he used, obviously building on the notion of genes, but he used the Greek term memetics or mimesis, which stands for imitation and replication through imitation, in order to capture this quality of information to self-replicate from mind to mind. So we have this understanding of information as for stories or patterns which self-propagate through a process of imitation. So this is how they replicate. Importantly though, this is an iterative process. It's not an exact process. And this is a really important realization because as pointed out by James Glick here in his piece What Defines a Meme, memes are seldom copied exactly. Their boundaries are always fuzzy and they mutate with a wild flexibility that will be fatal in biology. Right? So unlike genes, when it comes to information replicating itself from mind to mind, there is always an element of iteration. Right? So this is inevitable. This is independent of the internet as such, right? So this has always been happening, and you can experience this when you're looking at the way, for example, jokes spread. There is always a certain iteration to their telling, or fairy tales for that matter, right? There is always a certain iteration. There is always some sort of alteration happening as they are propagating from mind to mind and through time. Now, obviously, this process of replication, this iterative process, is affected by the media over which it performs itself, right? So whether that medium is language, and that's obviously how memes and stories and any sort of packaged information patterns replicate from mind to mind. Usually that's the medium is language, but that medium might also be something else entirely, right? So the way memes, the way information patterns replicate is entirely a function of the medium which is used. And I'm using here a reading of the medium which is informed by Marshall McLuhan's dictum, right? The medium is the message. So his definition of media is extensions of ourselves, right? And the way he frames media in this definition is extensions of ourselves which have direct consequences, right? And any change in the medium automatically generates a new message because of the new scale that is being introduced with the change in the medium, right? So this scale, this change is measurable, and it can be discerned, right, by the emergence of a new message. So when it comes to what's important here for my purposes for this lecture is to understand that when it comes to understanding the spread of information and the flow of information over different media, a change in the medium automatically formats a new scale and a new behavior, a new pattern of that flow and of the way information propagates and self-replicates. And this realization has enormous value because on the one hand, if you're working on a project online, the choice of platform, the choice of specific location, even if you will, of your content should be dictated at least in part by the way it formats the content, that formats the information packages, the message that you want to generate. And so this understanding is of tremendous importance, but also on a more abstract level, it's really important to understand that when it comes to the emergence of the internet and this phenomenon of distributed media production that we'll be talking about down the track in this mini lecture, there has been a fundamental shift in media from this notion of media as product, which is residual in what I describe as the legacy media paradigm or the industrial paradigm. So from media as product to media as conversation. And media as conversation is a really interesting concept because it stands for media as a sort of dialogic paradigm of open-ended process of to and fro, which does not have any sort of finished coherence and does not have the appearance or the feeling of a commodity or a product, right? It's always open-ended. But to understand that, we first need to understand this notion of media as product, and we need to first quickly map what the industrial paradigm actually is. So from the perspective of media, but not only, right, because you could extend this mapping to any artifact for that matter, whether it's something that from daily use or any sort of material artifact. The industrial paradigm is characterized by the phenomenon of mass production, right? So you have the logic of the assembly line here. Production and mass in quantity for a mass set of consumers, right? So mass production demands and is the one side of an equation, and the other side of that equation is mass consumption. Mass production demands mass consumption. Obviously, you need the masses to consume that set of products that have been generated by an assembly line. The secondary here, the corollary to that is this notion of repetition. When it comes to the assembly line and the logic of the assembly line, any sort of variation, any sort of iteration is a bug. because it obviously breaks down the assembly line. So in an industrial paradigm setting, repetition is the default, right? So you are getting sameness, right, with maybe slight variations over long periods of time, obviously. So in the same way how car manufacturers are periodically introducing maybe a new color or a new shape, but the essential elements of that product remain unchanged. Like if you think about the car industry, nothing much has changed in the car industry since the internal combustion engine was invented, right? So more than 100 years already, we have a repetition of pretty much the same essential elements, right, with slight variation. So repetition, iteration is a bug. Fundamentally, it's a closed process, right? So the process of production, and this is key for my purposes, the process of production when it comes to material or immaterial media artifacts, for that matter, right? In the classical understanding of media, so think of film or text or audio, doesn't really matter. The process of creation is closed, and the output is a finished product which is there to be consumed in a passive manner because of the essential element of industrial paradigm, which is the legacy broadcast media model. And the fact that the process is closed, actually, when you think about it further, stands for this phenomenon that there is a sharp boundary, there is a separation between two key aspects of the creative process, which is the conception and the process of production itself, right? So when it comes to conception, you have some sort of planning, some sort of ideation, and some sort of formula, some sort of model for what it is to be made, and then you have the process of production itself. So within the realms of industrial paradigm model of creation, these two aspects of the creative process are separate, right? So you would have a design studio, design whatever object is to be made, and then that object travels conceptually to an assembly line, to a factory where it's being mass produced with zero iteration, right? Any iteration when it comes to the factory floor, to the assembly line, is a bug to be avoided, right? It's not a feature. And the entire process of production is in effect dictated by the logic of the assembly line, which is all about repetition and the creation of sameness, of homogeneity. And this is your typical assembly line situation, and you could substitute the cars here and the workers repeating certain tasks with, for example, a TV station, and the repetition of sameness day in, day out, the same type of content appearing at the same times in a closed process, delivering consumables, basically commodities to be consumed. And we should contrast this with the internet paradigm, and that's what I'm building towards, because the internet paradigm, the paradigm within which distributed production appears as a phenomenon, we don't have centralization anymore, right? So there is no mass production. So for a mass of passive consumers, instead we have distributed production for in effect a massive amount of different niches, and this is sort of abstract when you think about it at first sight, but actually what it stands for is that you have infinite potential for variation because of the ability of one node in the network to participate with any aspect of the creative process in a distributed way, right? So you could be collaborating with people across the world online in real time in a distributed production process, right? In sharp contrast to the assembly line process. And you could be customizing content, information in effect, for a massive number of equally distributed niche user groups, right? So distributed production, mass customization. The corollary element here is that because the process is open, right? We have the element of continuous update. So this is not a prepackaged, closed product at the end of that production process. It's a open process. It's a conversation, as I framed it, right? As opposed to a closed product, in which rather than repetition, iteration is a feature. So repetition becomes a bug. If someone keeps producing the same videos on YouTube, chances are people will stop engaging with them, right? Because iteration is the future here. It's to be expected, as opposed to a repetitive production of sameness, homogeneity. And the end point here is that rather than having a finished, internally coherent, closed off media artifact which acts as a product, as a commodity to be consumed, we are faced with something which is, again, let's call it a media artifact, which is open, conversational, can be accessed at any point, can be modulated, and as an effect is in an eternal beta, right? It's never finished. It's always presumed open for negotiation, open for remediation, remix, etc., etc. And while in the industrial paradigm, when it comes to the process itself, the creative process, we established that there is a sharp boundary between conception and production. Online, this boundary disappears. It's continuously dissolved precisely because of this element of the open process leading to a state of eternal beta. So the boundaries between production and conception are dissolved, and what this means in practice is that a media artifact online can be continuously modulated in an iterative cycle of reconceptualization and reproduction, right? Leading to a situation where you have serialized iterations. And I'm reaching now to the title, obviously, for this lecture, series and iteration, because this dissolution of the boundary between production and conception leads to this fuzzy state of serialized iteration over time. And of course, we on the user side of that process, we experience this as the logic of mass customization, because any media artifact is in effect infinitely recombinant, infinitely customizable, right? Because again of the state of eternal beta. So let's juxtapose the two paradigms together. We have industrial paradigm and internet paradigm. Remember, we started this entire exploration with the two notions, media as product versus media as conversation. So you can see how this is mapped here. We have mass production versus distributed production, right? Mass consumption versus mass customization. Repetition versus iteration. Closed process leading to finished consumables versus an open process leading to artifacts in internal beta. Okay, so now that we have this as a foundation, let's start looking at some examples. And the first proposition that I'm making here is that the internet paradigm, as we have mapped it so far, leads to the emergence of a completely new aesthetics of content, aesthetics of information. This is not such a revolutionary thing to say. It's a quite trivial observation, in fact, because again, the medium is the message, right? So the emergence of a new medium ends up generating a completely new set of messages with new affordances, new scales. And when it comes to internet aesthetics, we have the emergence, and again, this is because of the effect and affordances of the internet paradigm, and this notion of the open process and the eternal beta. So it leads to the emergence of an aesthetics of remix, of mass customization, of artifacts with fuzzy boundaries. There is an aesthetics of the amateur, right? The rejection of the polished finished product. There's a certain aesthetics associated with the finished and polished product, and these aesthetics are outright rejected, right? Because they reek of professionalism, they reek of a legacy paradigm. Whereas what we have here is the fact that everyone can generate content ends up generating a certain expectation of the amateur quality of that content, right? So MS Paint, right, ends up almost as a fetishized tool of production, of mass production. We have the emergence of imitation and rapid prototyping, hacking, modding, glitch, kawaii, and this notion of mess. So let's look at a few examples. And the first example, and I'm just showing a brief video of that, is obviously Vaporwave as the emergent aesthetic format for content online. So just by looking at this footage, you can see how it's qualified by kind of very messy, glitchy, very amateurish engagement with content. So we have overexposure, glitch, obviously. We have the fetishization of the late 80s, early 90s music, which was being used in the product ads, and obviously MS Paint. So Vaporwave is a fascinating topic, but that's something for another lecture. What I wanted to show you next is, again, this notion of glitch, and the glitch aesthetic is an emergent aesthetic specific to the internet and to these modes of distributed online content production. So I recommend you guys to explore this artist Julie Watai. Her website is juliewatai.jp. She's a Japanese artist who is experimenting with glitch and with glitch aesthetics. And I'm focusing on glitch here because the aesthetics of glitch is, in a way, the aesthetics of the unexpected iteration, the unexpected mutation of content, right? Which is quite familiar to everyone who has worked with any sort of advanced visual software, and especially if you have made any mistakes or there have been bugs in whatever it is that you've been doing. So glitch is an emergent quality here of digital content, which ends up being aestheticized because it's native to this new medium, right? This is important for us because, again, we are trying to map the parameters of network production, distributed network production, and to understand what the key affordances are in this context. So we've already touched on this idea of glitch, the idea of mess, the idea of the random, weird, strange iteration, and this is also emerging in a wider context of experimentation with content and with code online, which involves again the aestheticization of hacking, of the emergence of the unexpected. So we have again the modding of games. The next example I'm showing you is known as the San Andreas streaming deer cam, which ran a few years ago on Twitch. So someone, this American artist Brent Watanabe, set a live video stream from a computer running a hacked and modded version of Grand Theft Auto 5, and he hosted it on Twitch. And so the mod basically involved a point of view camera following a deer in the game, and the deer was wandering randomly in a random manner through this fictional environment in California, and the deer was programmed to control itself and to make its own decisions without anyone playing it, right? So it was unscripted, and it was generating all sorts of unexpected situations, and it had a cult following of people who were looking for those unexpected situations, for those glitches. So the deer cam is interesting for us because of this aspect of modding and manipulating and shifting something which was intended as a product, right, a game, into a completely new track, into this deer cam, and shifting also to different platforms, right? So the game becomes a Twitch experience with which users can engage through the live chat. So again, we have this notion of the open process, the eternal beta, even a nominally closed experience, such as the closed and prepackaged, if you will, experience, such as engaging with information commodity, right, such as a game, becomes an open beta, an eternal beta, in fact, through this example of the deer cam. Another example is this, again, when it comes to mess and the completely strange and weird aesthetics emerging from the mixture of different information streams, right? The recombinant nature of media and content as information, as conversation, is this example of Twitch aesthetics, right? So since we talked about Twitch just now, here is an example of one of the most famous Twitch streamers, Asia Godstone. Look at his screen, right? Look at the mess and the information overload, which then again is what is really appealing about his stream to his followers, right? Because you have all sorts of different levels of engagement with him as the streamer here, as the originator of the communication process, the originator of this media artifact, if you will, but also with the artifact itself. So you have multiple conversational layers within the same media artifact appearing here, right? So on the one hand, you have users engaging with the streamer through his live chat. On the other hand, you have people donating and him engaging with them, and with the donations, and with the live chat, and with the game he's playing, right? So you have multiple levels of engagement operating as ongoing conversations, which also are quite ethereal in and of themselves. Another example is a very famous Australian female streamer, ExMinx. She's from South Australia. And again, you can see another way of organizing that quite messy visual surface. There is a certain aesthetics here, the aesthetics of engagement. Notice how this doesn't fit in any way in a legacy visual paradigm, right? Legacy visual aesthetics simply stop to a grinding halt when it comes to the affordances of this medium. All right, so to reassess, we have the emergence of internet aesthetics, which is characterized by this phenomenon of remix and customization, and the maturization of the process of production. Right? Media becomes conversational, becomes dialogic. We have rapid prototyping experimentation, right? We have the emergence of iterative series is the default form. And building on that, now let's look at a slightly more complex example, which I will use to jump to the next suggestion in this lecture. So what I'm about to show you is a really quite complex media artifact coming from the war in Syria. And the reason why I frame it as a complex media artifact is because this is actually a curated footage. The origins of this footage are from a battle in Daraa in southern Syria. And the footage starts with a news agency called Ana News putting GoPro cameras on Syrian army tanks as these tanks enter jihadi terrorist territory and in the ongoing battle. And so we have these GoPro cameras capturing live data feeds from the tanks and streaming them to online. And so there is an element of production of raw footage here, right? What comes next is really interesting though, because you will see that there is other footage coming from the jihadis themselves, which also has been put online. And then finally we have, or rather, the second stage here is that we have websites such as Global Leaks, but not only, the platforms such as Global Leaks, who act as aggregators for this content appearing. And then finally, there is an element which is which I frame as curation, where someone, an unknown person, an anonymous curator, has captured this content from these two different data feeds and recombined it into yet another new artifact, right? So again, this is an illustration of the recombinant nature of online content and of this notion of media as conversation. But what's key for us is these stages of production, aggregation, curation. So let's take a look.
Subscribe to Global
So something very interesting is happening here, because we have raw data appearing both from the perspective of these GoPro cameras on Syrian army tanks and from the perspective of the jihadis who are fighting the Syrian army. So both of these groups of people are uploading raw footage online. Someone else entirely ends up aggregating that footage. If you could visual example, imagine this is just putting that footage next to each other, but then again, someone else entirely ends up curating that footage into yet another, yet a new media artifact, right? So information as an effect is illustrated here as an open-ended process, right? And we already sort of mapped this as a phenomenon, right? When we talked about the internet paradigm, information acts as conversation, and this leads us to our effort now to frame distributed production and to start understanding what distributed production actually entails, right? This leads us to the essential element in our lecture. So Axel Bruns defines this process, right? He calls it producage, as a shift from dedicated individuals and teams to acting as producers. Remember, we're talking about a three-stage process: production, aggregation, curation. So a shift from dedicated individuals acting as producers to a broader-based distributed generation of content by a wide community of participants. So wide, potentially global community participates in real time or in asynchronously in the distributed generation of content. And building on that, these participants are not fixed in their roles, right? So not only the content itself is in a stage of open beta, but the participant roles are as well in the same stage, right? They are also in a beta, in the sense that participants can move between roles and play all sorts of different roles in that conversational process. They can jump in and out of it continuously, right? With a very wide spectrum of potential approaches from professional to amateur. Right, and again, we're returning here to this concept of the amateur emerging as the aesthetic, if you will, pinnacle of this process, right? Because at the end of the day, they are far more amateurs than professionals, and we will see down the track in another example from me in a competitive environment, right? When it comes to competing for attention, amateurs will always, invariably, axiomatically defeat professionals. Without exception, in fact. And I'll give you an example of how this works in practice. Moreover, what is at the end of this process, right? The artifacts, the media artifacts that are being generated are no longer products, right? This notion of the media as product is over. So they're no longer products in the traditional sense. They are unfinished and open. Presumed to be continuously under development, right? So again, the eternal beta. And crucially, right, the way Bruns frames it, this state of eternal beta is evolutionary, right? So there is a inbuilt element of iteration here. It's iterative and it's palimpsestic, so it involves partial or even full rewriting of any aspect of that artifact, right? So because this is what palimpsest stands for. So to reassess, we have distributed generation of content. Anyone can generate content. Anyone can act as a producer. We have a fluid movement of now producers, right? So people who are both users and producers of content between roles. Content itself, right? So the media artifact, which is at the end point of this process, is no longer packaged as product. It's presumed to be continually unfinished. It's in a state of eternal beta, and this process itself is open, right? It's a process of continuing collaboration, and we have media as conversation. And now I want to try and represent this process visually for you. So I've framed this as a distributed production lifecycle. And there are two axes here. One is the serialization, the other one is the iteration axis. And we have here our three elements, right? Production, aggregation, and curation. So when you think of the example of this raw footage from Syria that I just gave you, we obviously have the production of raw data, but again, importantly, this is never a one-off, right? In the paradigm which we're trying to understand, all production is serialized. If it's not, it effectively disappears, right? It's a dead end, right? There's no or very limited conversation possible in that context. But when it is serialized, and in the context of the ANA News raw data, right? So we had, and you can still find them on YouTube and on LiveLeak, especially hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of raw data footage from GoPros on tanks. So we have serialized production, which can be aggregated along this series axis in potentially infinite types of series, right? So it can be aggregated for all sorts of different audiences in all sorts of different frames. And importantly, these aggregates, right, these serialized aggregates can be curated along the iteration axis for all sorts of different audiences. So content can be extracted from them and curated in a completely new setting in an iterative format, right? So this content can mutate into a completely new context, into a completely new media artifact as a result of this process of curation. And now importantly, this triad of elements which build the distributed production lifecycle are themselves in a loop, right? So there is a continuous element of production, aggregation, and curation of content here, which can be entered by participants at any one point, right? So this is fundamental. There is no expectation of professionalism. So anyone can enter that process and can enter it at any one point. So you could add your own variations on that content by producing it and adding to that process, which in turn triggers new types of aggregation, new serializations, and further curation down the track. All right, so far so good. This is, I hope, quite clear. However, we have not really engaged with time as a vector so far. So all of these arguments I'm making could be imagined as to be operating asynchronously over a long period of time. What happens with real time? That's an interesting question in itself. What happens when we constrict the time and start operating in a near real-time situation as the affordances of the internet allows? And the argument I'm about to make now is that the affordances of network participation lead to the emergence of completely new type of distributed media production, which is basically dictated and characterized by this phenomenon of collective intelligence, right? So collective intelligence is the dominant form of distributed media production, especially when it comes to real-time production. So let's try and understand what is creative intelligence, what is involved here. And that concept of creative intelligence was invented by French media theorist Pierre Levy in 1994. So these are the early years of the popularization of the internet to the masses, right? So this is the time of the browser wars, Netscape, and the about to emerge Internet Explorer with Windows 95. So this is the early days of the popular internet. In Pierre Levy's concept, collective intelligence, the way he frames it, is a form of universally distributed intelligence. So we have this notion of universality, of a global distribution of some sort of emergent phenomenon, which is constantly enhanced, coordinated in real time, and resulting in the effective mobilization of skills. Now let's parse this down, and let's analyze these elements one by one. So first, this notion of universally distributed. We have in effect a distributed global network of potential participants. Anyone can join in the process, right? Remember this, we already established that these are open processes, can be accessed at any point. There is a fluidity between roles. There is no expectance of some sort of authority / professionalism. In fact, these claims to authority and professionalism are invariably laughed at and ignored. We have potentially global network of potential participants emerging. We have this phenomenon of constantly enhanced, right, which stands for an open process of continuous iteration, right, which leads to fast innovation cycles. And again, the example I'll give you illustrates this point quite well. The notion of coordination in real time, we already established this earlier, right? The collective intelligence appears especially when you have that element of coordination in real time. So this is characterized by fast feedback loops across the entire emergent collective intelligence network, right? This element of fast feedback loops is quite interesting because when you think of legacy media organization or any sort of industrial form of production, usually this sort of organization is quite centralized, hierarchically, vertically integrated, and it operates as a centralized network with very slow internal coordination, with very slow feedback loops when it comes to its engagement with the outside of the network. Not so in a distributed environment. Feedback loops are always very fast, so information processing and decision making is always very fast, and it appears to happen almost in real time. And again, the example I'll give you in a moment illustrates this quite well. And finally, we have this phenomenon of effective mobilization of skills. And this is quite interesting because it maps to what we established earlier, the absence of prescribed roles, the fluidity between roles, and the absence of this notion of professionalism and authority. So we have, in effect, what emerges is a real-time iterative self-selection based on expertise. So in practice, this works in this way. Let's say you know how to edit images, so you contribute to the process by editing images. And maybe someone knows how to edit audio, or maybe someone has analytical skills, or maybe someone has time and the ability to dedicate some attention to a problem, right? So someone has an element of cognitive surplus which they can dedicate to that collective intelligence process. So we have the universally distributed intelligence, constantly enhanced, coordinated in real time, resulting in an effective mobilization of skills. Now let's look at an example. And our example comes from really interesting happening which occurred in early March 2017. So, and this was first, it started as an artistic happening, started by Shia LaBeouf, the American actor. And so the happening was organized around this concept of "He will not divide us," and this was in a reaction to the election of Trump to the US presidency. And so this ended up being a sort of a game almost between 4chan and Shia LaBeouf's project. So what I will show you now is the second part of this game of between 4chan and Shia LaBeouf, where the "He Will Not Divide Us" art installation moved from New York, where it was basically trolled to oblivion, to an undisclosed location somewhere in the United States. And let's see what happened next.
War has changed. It's an endless series of proxy battles fought by mercenaries and machines. Nanomachines inside their bodies enhance and regulate their ability.
After defeat on the battlefields of New York and New Mexico, Shire headed to a new hidden location. No more chanting or interaction. This latest exhibit would just be a flag waving arrogantly in front of a camera. There were no landmarks, no scenery, no clues at all to its whereabouts. It would be impossible to find, and nothing could stop the broadcast. Checkmate. And this would allow Shire to act smug for the next 4 to 8 years. That is, unless Pohl's agents could find a way to track it down. Challenge accepted. It was to be the greatest game of capture the flag ever. Pohl began organizing. They set about gathering all the information they could on the local environment, trying to match up cloud, wind patterns, and ambient noise. Because it was a live stream, they could match the time of sunset to quickly discern that the flag was somewhere in the Eastern time zone. That's 2/3 of the country ruled out in one move. Others began looking into intel about Shire's whereabouts, as it was highly likely that he was present for the raising of the flag itself. As time went on, distinct noises could be heard in the background, the croaking of frogs, suggesting water nearby. Then, the second big break, in the distance, just faintly, 2 jet streams. Pohl quickly opened a live feed of all of the air traffic across the eastern seaboard, but identifying these 2 lines, amongst all of this, would be a challenge. Meanwhile, social media trackers found this post. At a small town diner in Tennessee, this waitress couldn't help but brag about her run-in with Shire. It was another big break. TMZ also reported that Shire had been seen fly fishing in the area. The search was closing in on Greenville, Tennessee. The hunt was moving much faster now. According to the aviation team, 2 more planes would soon be flying overhead. If they could be spotted on the live stream, Pohl would have confirmation. Bingo. To further narrow down the search area, the aviation team started charting all of the flight paths of spotted planes. But they still needed more information, and as day turned to night, they got it. Pohl's astronomy division used the constellations to narrow down the angle and rough position of the camera. With this, the flight paths, and some advanced trigonometry, the candidate area had been reduced way down. Further confirmation from weather satellites backed up the claim as an agent was dispatched to the scene. As he drew close, he started honking the horn, while viewers of the live stream gave feedback as it got louder. A few minutes later, target sighted. But he couldn't just head in during broad daylight and risk Shire's wrath. Instead, he had to wait for the cloak of night. In the meanwhile, Pohl got to work devising an infiltration strategy. A few hours later, the flag came down, and a MAGA hat and shirt went up. It was a beautiful moment, and it all took place on the live stream. Pohl's Central Intelligence Agency had clocked Windu Season 3 in 38 hours and 14 minutes, and poor Shire was divided for a 3rd time. Could he ever recover? Could this be the end? Well, as I was editing this video, there has been an update. The stream has gone down and the MAGA hat and shirt with it, but intel indicates that the flag will be up again soon. A drone was flown over the area, and you can see here that Shire is keeping guard of the flagless Pohl. In response, Operation Eagle Eye is on standby. The drone carries a sophisticated device. You can see here a MAGA hat, Confederate flag, and bucket. To find out what will happen next.
Alright, so what we have here is a clear illustration of this concept of creative intelligence as developed by Pierre Levy, because we have universally distributed participation, right? So the participation in the He Will Not Divide Us Capture the Flag exercise was global. It's a constantly enhanced process, right? So we have constant iteration based on clues. With a really important point here is that the clues that ended up being chosen as correct by the collective intelligence swarm appearing were not chosen based on authority, but chosen based on how relevant the swarm construed them as being in relation to the challenge here. We have a process which is coordinated in real time, right, over 38 hours. And in effect, mobilization of skills based on self-organization, right? More importantly, self-organization between anonymous participants, right? No one knows who everyone else is in this process. So here you have an extreme example of collective intelligence participating in the process of distributed production. And if you try and parse it, you can again look at this graph and the three essential elements that I identified. So production, aggregation, and curation in a continuous feedback loop within this two-dimensional space involving serialized iteration. All right, that's it from me. Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, hit me up on Twitter at TedMeetYou. See you online.